First, I'd like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land that many of us are meeting on today, recognise other people or families with connection to the lands of the ACT and the region. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contributions they make to the life of this city and region, and I extend that recognition to the traditional custodians of all the other lands which staff and participants are gathered on today, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending today's seminar. So we've got people from across the place and just want to make sure logistics are settled. So if everyone can please make sure that their microphones are on mute and their cameras off if you're not presenting or asking a question. We'll be recording today's session and that's just started now, so there'll be an opportunity to look back on it. We'll have the presentation and then there'll be a chance for questions at the end. So please, you can either put your hand up and the panellists will address your question, or you can post into our chat channel. Just a little touch on background for those of you who are joining us for the first time today. The Centre of Excellence for Biosecurity Risk Analysis, CEBRA, is a long-standing biosecurity research initiative hosted by the University of Melbourne. CEBRA plays a vital role in providing the Australia and New Zealand governments with expert biosecurity risk analysis and advice that helps inform a range of our biosecurity risk management activities. Today we're in for a real treat with three of our dedicated CEBRA researchers joining us to explore the value of pre-border capacity building for biosecurity. We've got Professor Tom Kompas, Associate Professor Anca Hanea, and Dr. Lu-Yi Wang. Professor Tom Kompas is the Chief Investigator at CEBRA, a Professor of Environmental Economics and Biosecurity in the School of Agriculture, Food and Ecosystem Science, and Research Group Director for the Centre for Environment and Economics Research at the University of Melbourne. Tom's research specialises in large dimensional economic modelling for trade and climate change, cost-benefit analysis, and natural resource and environmental economics. Associate Professor Anca Hanea is also a Chief Investigator at CEBRA. Anca is a probabilistic modeller with a background in pure and applied mathematics and risk and environment modelling. Dr. Lu-Yi Wang is a research fellow with CEBRA. Lu-Yi is an evolutionary biologist and behavioural ecologist who's working on evaluating the impact of the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research investment in biosecurity measures in Southeast Asia. So please welcome me in joining Tom, Anca and Lu-Yi. Over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Julia. Lovely introduction, thank you for that. And thanks to everyone who's online. We really appreciate you joining in and hearing the message we're about to deliver. I'm going to ask Louis and Anca to unpack the case study that we're talking about today in a minute, in terms of the sort of value of pre-border biosecurity. But I want to start with some introductory remarks, because it's an exciting time here at CEBRA for pre-border biosecurity, and arguably, it's about time that we take a closer look at pre-border biosecurity. So we're really quite excited about it. We've just finished a project with ACR. Looking at pre-border measures in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Timor, and that's gone really well. And now it's extended to a new project with ACR, looking at sort of redesigning, remapping, perhaps changing considerably biosecurity measures in Indonesia. So that's about to start. We've also just finished a project, the one that we're talking about today, with Jennifer Davis and the Office of Chief Vet, looking at pre-border measures in particular in Indonesia and Timor and other places. And also, we're just about to start a project with Nathan Reed and Shay in the Compliance and Enforcement Division, looking at the impact, the rate of return on their measures. So I've come to the view with these case studies, and also with a project that we've been working with MPI New Zealand on, which I'll talk about in a minute. I've come to the view that the return on investment on pre-border measures is really quite substantial. I think we've commonly underestimated the returns we get from pre-border measures, and these case studies and the work we did with MPI New Zealand are solidifying that view. The returns can be really quite large. For New Zealand, for example, let me just talk about that for a minute. This is a project, again, with MPI New Zealand, looking at the value of the biosecurity system as a whole. It's a counterpart, in a sense, an extension of the work we've done with DAFF on the value of biosecurity generally. asking the question, what's the extra return? What's the return, if you like, from having biosecurity measures in place? And in fact, it's looking at, if you're not familiar with the value of the biosecurity model in DAFF, it's looking at the avoided damages that accrue from having a biosecurity system in place, damages that would accrue to asset layers that are relevant to Australia from pests and diseases, compared to having no system in place. And indeed, the returns in the DAFF value of biosecurity model were quite high on average, basically a 30-to-1. That indeed is an average benefit cost ratio. It's the avoided damages from having a system in place, protecting us from pests and diseases crossing the border and affecting our asset layers, compared to the cost of the biosecurity system per se. 30-to-1 is a really, really good return. In the New Zealand MPI project, we extended that. We've extended that. The whole team has extended that. It's not just Anca, myself, and Louis, but also Christine, who's online, John Baumgartner, who's online, Julia, who's perhaps online. It's a bit hard to see now. There's so many people here, but we've extended that to include well-articulated pre-border and post-border layers, as well as the border layer, of course, and asked the question again. What are the damages that we avoid from having a biosecurity system in place relative to the cost of the system, the measures themselves? I don't have a green light to talk about all the details yet. I've just been out of a meeting with MPI New Zealand. They want me to hold on the specific details until later in the year, perhaps September, October. But the average return is in fact really high, very high, higher than the Australian case, and that's something that we can unpack later and see why it is different. But moreover, we've constructed with that what's called a value max model, asking the question, not just what is the average rate of return, but what are the extra returns, the return on investment from investing more in biosecurity as a whole and across different biosecurity layers, pre-border, border, post-border, and so on. It's called a value max model. And indeed, if you're an economist online, strap in, because that stuff is really, really exciting for us. It's the first time it's been done system-wide, asking the question, not what is the benefit cost ratio, but where is the best returns? Where are the best marginal returns on extra dollars spent in the biosecurity system and as a whole? And it turns out in that context, in the value max context, that we should be spending more on biosecurity in New Zealand, which makes MPI quite happy. But moreover, the highest rate of return across all those biosecurity measures is pre-border, and by a substantial amount. It's telling us that the pre-border measures in New Zealand generate the biggest bang for buck. Now we'll see perhaps at some point whether or not that holds for Australia if we develop a value max model for Australia, but for New Zealand it clearly does hold. And it's telling us again, along with the case studies that we've done at ACR projects, along with the work that Anca and Louis are about to unpack today in terms of what's called Project 24B with DAFF, and indeed with the new project that's coming, both for ACR and for DAFF, looking at pre-border measures. It's telling us that there's a lot of value to be gained by thinking about, looking at, and perhaps investing more in pre-border measures. So with that sort of prelude, I'm going to turn it over now to Louis and Anca to talk about the specific cases that we've looked at with Jennifer Davis and the team in the Office of the CBO. Our recent CEBRA project, what's called 24B. Louis, are you happy to start? I think she has some slides to share as well.
We've been trying to share the slides for quite a while. With the share button on our side doesn't really work. So
I was wondering because I was looking at you while I was talking, and it looked like you were very upset and confused. I thought, ooh, maybe I said something wrong. But no, okay, I understand.
It's just the share button doesn't work.
Yeah, sorry about that. We're just trying to get that fixed from our end. So if you're okay to kick off, and then we'll see if we can change the settings or share on your behalf.
Sure. Okay. Well, thanks, Tom, for that introduction. I must admit we were a bit distracted by the fact that we can't share the screen, but I'm very happy with we're both very happy with the way you set the the scene for us to talk about the benefits of pre-border capacity building for biosecurity. And there's very little that we can add in terms of introduction or context, since you pretty much said lots of things. It's fairly obvious what the goal of pre-border biosecurity is, and that's keeping the pests and diseases as the exotic ones as far as possible from Australia, and trying to do that by strengthening the biosecurity of the neighboring countries is one way to go about it. And if we can manage that and the region could effectively manage their existing biosecurity challenges, then we would probably be more successful in establishing a type of a buffer zone around Australia. That what it basically intends to do is, sorry, we got a message.
I've loaded an earlier version of the presentation if that helps, and I can step out if it's causing trouble. Can you see that?
Yeah, that works. I
think
guess
it works. It's got some edits in it that we could just ignore as we go forward,
okay.
but at least it works.
That's
Yeah.
great. Thanks, Tom. So if we move
Okay.
to the right.
So I'll take out the edits at some point, maybe if I can. But anyway, yeah.
Okay, so so Tom already added whatever he wanted to say to this. We're talking about the benefits to Australia and to in ways of protecting the agriculture and the environment and the public health and lots of other things that we would like to touch on, and maybe we will manage to convince you that there's other things that we get benefits from by doing pre-border biosecurity. And if we go to the next slide, you see that the benefits don't only go to are not only for Australia, obviously, but for the region in general, in terms of regional stability, say in terms of climate change resilience, and clearly for the relationship building with the rest of the countries around Australia, the neighboring countries. And it goes without saying that the benefits to the partner countries are quite a few, apart from the direct ones in strengthening technical capability, and that will trickle on in the increased agricultural productivity that will help food security and so on and so forth. So there's many benefits that we can talk about. And what we did through this project and the case studies we're going to be talking about is try to categorize them in different larger groups, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Next slide, Tom.
Yep.
This is going to be awkward.
Okay.
Okay, so this is work that started quite a while ago with a group of us here at CEBRA and CER working on several projects that try to evaluate the pre-border investments, and we've been doing that for DAFF and also for ACR, and we'll show you a little bit about that. We'll talk about that a bit later. And we took an approach of looking to case studies and trying to build up a structured framework that would have clear steps in this evaluation sort of process. And the building blocks the building blocks of this framework. No, Tom, the previous slide was fine. The previous, thank you. This is going to be fun. Building blocks. So we found that the theory of change at the beginning of this evaluation project is an absolutely essential step, and that's a mapping what the project itself was doing during its course. So looking at what were the activities, what were the interventions, and what they intended to do, what were the outputs of those activities and interventions in the specific countries that they were enacted, and then going further and linking that with specific outcomes and potentially measurable outcomes that then would lead to impacts. And as I said, we kind of group those impacts in economic impacts, environmental impacts, social and cultural. Sometimes they're together, sometimes they're separate. both for Australia and for in-country. And once this mapping of the project is done, then we can start doing something called counterfactual analysis, where we look at what would have happened, investigate what-if scenarios. What would have happened if this intervention didn't happen, if the investment was not there? What would different dimensions of these impacts, being economic, environmental, cultural, whatever, how would they evolve in time with or without the intervention? And measuring the difference between this intervention and not intervention scenarios will give us a size of the impact. And that impact can be calculated in a quantitative manner. And if we can add economic values and dollar values to that, that's even better. That brings the story home quite effectively. But very often we find that there's a lot of qualitative analysis that's needed to complement these quantitative measures. So in most of the case studies we worked on, we used a mixed method approach, where qualitative analysis or semi-structured interviews, qualitative narratives were used to complement the quantitative story that we could tell. And one of those stories is, for example, the last picture on this series of little pictures is a pest distribution, a prediction of a mango pest distribution in Australia under climate change. And you may or may have not seen that in the previous webinar that talked about this about this project. And we can now go to the next slide, Tom. And in a new version of the slides that didn't really make it to this presentation, what I did have there was a link to a QR code to the previous webinar that happened last year and was given by Tracy Hollings and Edith and I think Tom was there. The whole team was there really, but there was a detailed presentation, CEBRAnar, on the ACR Center for International Agricultural Research that looked at, so the project that we worked on that looked at the 3 case studies, the mango pest for the Philippines, CSF in Indonesia, and HPAI in Indonesia. So if you check that out, it's somewhere on the YouTube channel, you'll find all the details about those ones. So those were case studies that we built on and refined this framework that we're using now to evaluate, or we used recently to evaluate other case studies for the department. And those were the canine rabies in Timor-Leste, investment in FMD in Indonesia, and then we also had a very brief case validation using a very different case study on fumigation in Indonesia. So I'm going to talk about one of these case studies, and then we will continue with other insights about the other case studies. So I start with the rabies one. Tom?
I also sent Tom the update slides.
Okay, so the first, Tom, do you want to switch? I think we can stay with these ones for now.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So the first case study we looked at and tried to use this evaluation framework for is about the canine rabies control in Timor-Leste, and it's concerning the fairly recent investment of the government in this pre-border biosecurity, which was continuing the investment that happened with help, like against the canine rabies in Indonesia. The West Timor, so the other half of the island was already had canine rabies prior to this being detected in Timor-Leste, and about a year ago, investment to help Timor-Leste started, and that's the investment that we looked at in terms of this framework. So we did exactly the same sort of steps: theory of change, counterfactual scenarios, and then we tried qualitative and quantitative analysis. And what we tried to do is specifically target pre-border investment and link this investment with with the quantitative analysis of how does the likelihood of an event of canine rabies to come to Australia, how does that change given the current investment? Next slide, Tom. Okay, so again, in the updated version, there's a bit of detail on how we did that. So if you just concentrate on the map on the in the corner, we started this with acknowledging that there's actually not much known about any quantitative analysis about the likelihood of an outbreak in Australia of canine rabies given investment or lack of investment. Where does it come from? What's the most likely pathway? Any type of pathway risk analysis? We found very little about it, and we started with that and organized an expert elicitation. Well, a couple of them actually, and that's another thing that if you go through the CEBRAnar lists, the previous ones, and look at the ones that I was involved in, which I think there are a couple, they would always have a structured expert judgment element in them. That's something that we always propose when we know for sure that there's no enough data available, but we still want to have a high-level quantification of risks and probabilities and likelihoods. And we're usually using something called an IDEA protocol, which is developed here at the University of Melbourne over the course of many years. And I'm sure many of the participants here in this CEBRAnar are either are aware of it or were actually tortured as experts in these solicitations, and we can't tell you how grateful we are for that, because there's two options. We can ignore whatever part of the model can be quantified, or we can acknowledge that uncertainty and try and harvest the knowledge that experts have and try and put that in numbers, quantifying estimates and uncertainty around them. So with the help of DAFF and Tiffany, thank you very much for that. If you're here, thanks again. We reached out to many experts. The time frames were very short, so we didn't have an excellent response rate, but we did have an excellent group of experts in the end who helped us identify the most probable pathways of arrival of canine rabies to Australia from Timor-Leste or from the surroundings. They are in this plot that you have up there. They're marked with P1, P2, and P3. That pathway 1, pathway 2, and pathway 3. Pathway 3 is something that was quantified before, and there was a little bit of information about that, and experts were more familiar with ways of rabid dogs coming from the southern Papua Island to Australia. The other two pathways were fairly new because they were trying to assess the fact that the Timor Island recently got rabies as well. And after we came to the conclusion that these are the three pathways that we're interested in, and if an outbreak will happen through those three pathways, then we started quantifying the likelihood of this to happen, of an outbreak to happen on each of the pathways and under three different scenarios. We initially started with a no investment scenario, which is like the counterfactual one. What would have happened if the investment didn't occur? And then compare that with what will actually happen or what can happen given the 1 year investment. So at the time, it was about 1 year of investment that we were evaluating. But during the first workshop with experts, we got very clear signals that it's a little bit too optimistic to try and see any sort of impact after just 1 year. This was something that they all the experts agreed on. 1 year of investment is not nearly enough to have visible impact. So we talked about, and when we asked them to quantify different likelihoods and different components for us to simulate and estimate this annual outbreak rate, we also took into account a third scenario, which was the long-term investment, which is what they also should happen. And on the right-hand side in the corner, you see a plot that looks at this annual outbreak rate, which takes into account all our expert estimates and a simulation exercise that we did, split on pathways and scenarios. And maybe the first thing that you can notice in this graph is that under scenario 1, the uncertainty around, so each of the plots have a little dot, which is the best estimate, if you wish, the median situation, and then some credible bounds around it. So what's the worst that can happen, what's the best that can happen. And the right-hand side of that line would be what's the worst that can happen, is the larger annual outbreak rate. And you can see that under the first scenario with no investment, there's a very large uncertainty around all those numbers for all the pathways, except pathway 3, which is the one which makes sense given that that's the one that has been studied before, and there's lots of other interventions were talked about in that sort of on that pathway. And then as we go further, even though all experts agreed that you can't really see an investment, an impact after 1 year investment, the second scenario still has decreased uncertainty and decreased annual outbreak rates. And the smaller uncertainty and smaller rates are for scenario 3. And then if you put all of those together and just look at a general outbreak rate independent of the pathway, you can see on the left-hand side a histogram of how that looks like in terms of the 3 scenarios. Oh, next one, Tom. Sorry, I was changing the slides. So we took all of those into account. So that's how the experts think the outbreak rate will decrease given the investment. And now we'll have to see what would happen if an outbreak will occur. So you have on the right-hand side, you have a table that Louis worked very hard for putting together and estimating costs of an outbreak, of rabies outbreak in Australia for the different states that were the sinks of those pathways and for the different various dimensions that would be affected. So this would be the costs. How much did the DAFF investment, how much that was, is again on the left-hand side. On the left-hand side, you have the list that our colleagues very graciously gave us about what happened in that year that we were evaluating, and putting all of those together and weighting the potential economic impact with the probability of an outbreak to happen, we can calculate the expected net benefit for the avoided impact, basically. And we had two types of analysis that we did. We have a conservative estimate, which is if everything would be at its median, and you saw in those previous graphs that the median was quite skewed. It was quite close to the lower bound, so lots of worse things can happen towards the right-hand side or the tail of that distribution. So under a conservative scenario where experts thought nothing would really be visible, the return of investment is still almost double. If we look at a more realistic scenario where we actually look towards the tail of those distributions, then we have a return of investment 33 times bigger than that. So we think that's quite relevant. And I think that's, oh, maybe there's another slide, Tom? Yeah, and so that's the most quantitative thing that we could go through and calculate. But as I said, there's lots of other impacts that we could look at, and environmental impacts and social impacts. And in this particular case, again, part of those social impacts for Australia, for example, so the second bullet point there, maintaining a close bond between indigenous communities and the dogs, is that the cultural impact? Is that a social impact? That's another thing that we're still not sure if we need to tease that apart or leave them together. We're also not sure how to quantify that. So that's where the qualitative part of the analysis will come in and tell us more about how to present these stories. Another one that was fairly new for this project was the political impact, because working together, both Australia and Timor-Leste, but also the Timor-Leste government and the Indonesian government, that need for collaboration against canine rabies, that developed and strengthened the relationships in a political sort of scene. So there's lots of things that we could do and talk about if we were to have enough time and resources. And I think we can now go to the next case study that Louis will talk about.
The second case study we're looking at here is the REDS project, which is short for Regional Emerging Disease Support. The aim of this project is to help increase the Indonesians' capacity in response to FMD, lumpy skin disease, and potentially other emerging diseases as well. And to achieve this goal, the project focuses on increasing lab capacity in Indonesia laboratories, including lab technique training and data analysis training. And by boosting up these capacities, the project is expected to improve both the accuracy and testing capacity, which is crucial for detecting, diagnosing, and monitoring emergency and transboundary animal diseases. If they can detect the disease earlier, the more likely they can reduce the overall damage cost. For the evaluation for our evaluation, we here focus only on FMD because we have the economic valuation data available. Next, please. For the economic impact of this project, we evaluated quantitatively. We first extract the likelihood of FMD entering into Australia from a previous CEBRA structure expert judgment. And the result of this workshop showed that the probability of having an FMD outbreak in Australia increased from 0.09 to 0.12, increased 3% since 2021 due to the outbreaks in the neighboring countries. And next, we use the value model that developed by CEBRA to identify the top 4 susceptible assets to FMD. And because FMD is so contagious, so we expect that once FMD arrives Australia, it's going to spread all over the country very quickly. So here we combine the value of these assets or the expected damage to the 4 assets in 5 years to be around $9 billion. Next one, please. So here, we using the data set that I just described, we run the value model with increasing arrival rate and resulting in the corresponding damage. As you can see from the far left figure, the x-axis is the expected damage and the y-axis is the arrival rate. 4 colors represent 4 different assets respectively. And it shows that when arrival rate increase, the damage also increase. Assuming the capacity building from the REDS project will decrease 1% probability of FMD entering Australia. From this figure, it shows that the avoided damage is expected to be $90 million. The REDS project cost around $2 million, and the table here you can see the breakdown of the cost. This $2 million will be offset by a small decrease in arrival rate of FMD in Australia of around 0.023%, as you can see in the inset of the far right graph. Next one, please. So the economic impact to Australia was clearly demonstrated in the previous slide due to the decreased arrival rate to Australia. And for Indonesia, similarly, by increasing their diagnostic detection and these lab capacities in terms of detecting the disease, it lowered the chance of having big outbreaks. Therefore, it also helped maintain the stability of Indonesia's economy, as well as the management costs associated with outbreaks. And environmentally, lowering the chance of having an FMD outbreak or entering Australia will contribute to the animal welfare, as it reduces the chance of animals or livestock getting sick from FMD. For the social impacts, since FMD has a usually cause substantial damage to the industry. So lowering its chance entering in Australia will reduce the stress or anxiety of associated industries and stakeholders in Australia. And for Indonesia, there are many smallholders in Indonesia. And for smallholders, a few animals die will have a huge impact on the smallholder and their finance. Therefore, properly control the disease and lowering the chance having an outbreak will contribute to the stability of the household finance and potentially the food security in the long term. This project is, sorry, I have one more thing. This project work on the capacity building between, it's a collaboration between an Australian institute and Indonesian laboratories at national level, which potentially build up the collaboration and trust between the two countries in general. Next, please. Our third case study is our earlier evaluation project working partner with ACAR working on CSF control in Indonesia, and particularly in NTT province, which is circled on the map. This province, the assess project was working on this region mainly because, one of the reasons is because this province, different from rest of Indonesia, they are most Christians that eat pigs, so there are smallholders, unlike the rest of the majority of the Indonesian where they're Muslims. So this project, they mainly work on tracking animal movement legally and legally, but they also work a lot on awareness raising campaigns and capacity building, like they will teach the locals how to dispose sick pigs and tell them not to eat sick pigs, etc. And for this project, we listed as the top three boxes. You can see that we list the activities in this project and classify them whether we were able to evaluate or not. And for those we are able to evaluate, we further classified them into whether we can have qualitative or quantitative assessment. And for qualitative assessment, we mainly evaluate them through interviews with our Indonesian and Australian contacts who were involved in the projects. And also we have semi-structured interview in country, talk to the locals and people who were involved in the project around 10 years ago. For quantitative analysis, here we focus on a vaccine trial done by Associated Project. And for this project, they run a vaccine trial in one of the islands in province where they test the efficacy of 4 vaccines. And it turned out that the vaccine that were used by the local government at that time was not effective. So the local government took up the result of this trial, swapped to a more effective vaccines. And next one, please. So for the economic impact, we mainly focus on evaluating the economic impact of changing to a more effective vaccine. Here, specifically, we model the pig population increased as a result of changing to a more effective vaccine and calculated the benefit gained from this increased population. It turned out that the introduction of the more effective vaccine has a positive economic impact, delivering around $56 million over 10 years. So that is through the increased pig population and ultimately higher farmer income. Yes, next one, please. The economic impacts was demonstrated in the previous vaccine trial. And here I want to focus more on the qualitative assessment that we have obtained through semi-structured interviews. And environmentally, from our interview, we learned that as mentioned earlier, they run a lot of awareness campaign of biosecurity, including telling people do not dispose the pigs in the river, but rather bury them, because disposing the dead pigs in the river will have immediate negative environmental impact. But other than this, it also has some health concern, because the local people, they bathe in the river, and in some regions they even the river is the main source of fresh water, so it's not very hygienic for people who consume the water. One aspect that is missing on the slide, sorry, I was in the newer version, is the cultural impact. From the interview, we also learned that pigs play an important role in their culture. They are a symbol of wealth. They are important in their traditional ceremonies. For example, in Sumba, one of the islands in the province, they sacrifice around 50 pigs during the ceremony every day, and the whole ceremony will last around 3 months, which is a huge demand of pig population. Therefore, properly controlling the disease and maintain a stable pig population is important, and help the locals to keep practice their traditional ceremonies. Cultural impacts are often missed in evaluation or embedded in the social impacts. It's also our first time to try to evaluate the cultural impact. There are several challenges around evaluating cultural impacts, and ideally we'll have some social scientists and cultural experts involved. And Anca will touch more on the challenges and recommendations on this in this space later on.
Next slide. Thanks, Tom. Okay, so you had a flavor of a few of the case studies that we worked on. There were others. The CEBRAnar was posted in the chat about the mango. Thank you very much for that. We had enormous fun working on this, and we've learned so much. And what we've tried to do is summarize it in a generic sort of evaluation framework for pre-border biosecurity through this specific project. And we've identified 8 steps, which we pretty much ended up using in these case studies, and they seem to work quite nicely. So we always started with the theory of change to map the activities to outcomes, to outputs, and to the desired impacts of the project, either the ones that were formulated at the beginning of the project or the ones that happen during the project as flow-on effects and so on and so forth. We start with the generic one, and then we start trying to understand what's the framework in terms of the time frame and the spatial scale. Sometimes we have shorter projects that we evaluated. Sometimes other projects run for a longer time. There's different changes that happen in country and in Australia throughout a longer time frame. So there's different challenges that may happen in the evaluation. The spatial scale, the same sort of thing. There's trials that happen on a regional scale, and we were throughout the case studies trying to scale that up to the country level and even further to Australia level. What's the benefit for Australia? Once we've said that, we're in the position of actually trying to have a mental model or a causal model that links the activities to the impacts, or in case the causality is not there, we can look at correlational chains and try to build these models that will then be able to evaluate quantitatively. But to do that, the next step is to establish measurable indicators of success. What does it mean that you have a successful pre-border intervention? How do you measure that? Did you think of the measures right from the beginning, or are you looking at them as you go? The next step, once everything is settled, then we can try and formulate those what-if scenarios, the counterfactual scenarios that we can then model. And because we're heavily quantitative in this group, that's our playground. We play with lots of quantitative models, probabilistic ones, risk analysis models, economic ones. But if we can put numbers on things, that makes us very happy. But throughout all these case studies, we realized that that's not enough, and a mixed method that involves qualitative analysis, it's also very important. And that comes to the next step where we need to identify the resources needed for this. What's the data available? What if there is not enough data, can we go and do an expert judgment? Can we talk to the in-country experts and so on and so forth? And it happens to be the seventh step, but I don't think it needs to go there. I think engaging cultural experts and social scientists, that's something that should happen throughout the project from the beginning to the end. It just so happened that it became the seventh step in this analysis, is probably where we realized after identifying the resources needed that we do not have that cultural expertise or the social scientists who can tell us how to do a qualitative analysis better than how we did it. And at the end of the process, and again, step 8 it's also one that happens throughout the process, always identifying the assumptions that of the models that we're using and how sensitive the results are to what we're identifying as potential impacts is one of the necessary steps. So we took this general framework, and as any good modelers, we went, okay, let's validate this framework, see if it works in a completely different context. So we had a very brief case validation verification, and if you could change the slide, Tom. Thanks. So we did. We took that general framework and tried it in a completely different context. So most of our case studies are animal based, and then except the mango, and then we did. We were basically contacted by the team that works for the Australian Fumigation Accreditation Scheme, the AFAS, which their goal is to enhance offshore capacity to conduct and regulate methyl bromide fumigations as a pre-shipment treatment goods. And we met with the team working on this project and tried to see if we were to have enough time and resources, would that framework work for evaluating the brilliant work they do for more than 20 years. So this scheme is now, I think, fully operational in 11, 12 countries. So what we did is we had not so much time. We had a 3-hour validation workshop where a team of 6, 7 people were hybrid. A couple of them were in the room. Some of them were online. And we went through exactly the steps of the framework that you just saw earlier. We went and talked about following a semi-structured approach, idea-like sort of thing, where people were asked a question, they thought about it individually, we put everything together, we discussed and went to the next step. So we went through those 8 steps. And the point of this exercise was to check the coherence of the framework and the generalizability of the framework. Is it, since we've formulated it on other case studies, can we apply it? Does it make sense? Is it coherent? And we didn't have any major surprises. Also, we didn't have a lot of time. There was a lot of enthusiasm in the room and a lot of ideas that could be tried out. This is a project that, because it's on such a large time scale, has different challenges in applying this. And when, like I said, if you apply something for 20 years, or if you intervene and do, lots of things change in the way you do things or in the way the country receive them, in the adoption, in the governments, in that there's a number of factors that will influence what you can consider as consistent impact or procedure. Just like in all these other case studies, we had identifying cultural values, and especially for Australia, what would be the cultural value of this intervention? That was a very difficult step. And given that we only had 3 hours, we just agreed that that's hard, and we put it in the hard basket and didn't talk about it. So it didn't make it to the evaluation impact. But in the end, it was an exercise that showed us that this is a coherent framework that we can go on and use in different spaces that the ones we've built it with. Next slide, Tom. I think we can go next slide again. So with, I don't know if Tom wants to add anything to this summary. But and it's not that we need to summarize even more. I think economically, I think we're fairly confident that pre-border investment is cost effective, and we have examples on this slide talking about 33 times of initial investment or billions or millions of dollars in avoided damages. So I think hopefully we convinced you that that's an cost-effective thing to do. And as in terms of what lessons we've learned and what we think would be a good idea in terms of recommendations. So next slide, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've just summarized them in the order we thought maybe I don't know, order of importance, no idea. They're all important. They're all absolutely important recommendations, we think. Integrating that evaluation, doing that generic theory of change from the beginning of a project rather than just at the end and evaluate post hoc like we use it, we think would be important. If you have a plan to start with and you already identify what's a measurable output, what's a measurable impact, that then it will be throughout the process, you'll be able to know what data to collect, what to measure, how to look at the problem. You'll be able to anticipate what are the factors that could stand in your way, what would be good to do, and so on and so forth. The cultural expertise that we keep talking about, that's something that, again, we identified, incorporating that at the beginning of the process, being cultural values in Australia or cultural values of the country that is the recipient, that seems to be a very important thing that we could easily do, I suppose. And pilot and evaluate interventions, if things can happen in stages, if you could have like small pilot interventions, measure something, see what works, what doesn't, and go further and plan for the future. That's another thing that we thought would be important. And support that sustained adoption. All the evaluations we did had somewhere in those steps an implied adoption. We assumed that whatever interventions were proposed from the Australian side were implemented and adopted in the country, and that adoption continued after the end of the project. That was sometimes the case, and sometimes it wasn't. Doing something to make sure that that adoption stays there longer term, that'd be ideal. And it's listed as the last one on our list, but I think is as important as every other recommendation that we made. Strengthening the institutional collaboration. So we've worked with these projects with ACR and with DAFF, and we all want the same thing. And sometimes these investments happen in parallel rather than together. So we're thinking strengthening that collaboration from the beginning would definitely result in a more robust sort of investment and impact. And Tom, would you like to add?
No, I think I'm good. I think I'm good, actually. Thanks both. That was really well done. But generally, you can see that every time we look at a case study on pre-border biosecurity, when we can quantify, and we often can't, but when we can, we get substantial rates of return. In every one of those case studies, check the Mango one online because it's really quite impressive as well. And indeed, for the New Zealand case, which we'll talk about later in the year, that's system-wide. And system-wide, not a case study, but system-wide, and it shows that in fact pre-border measures generated a huge rate of return on investment. So we're excited about these things. We're keen to keep working on pre-border biosecurity for sure. And happy to take any questions, Julia. We can turn it back to you. We still have a little bit of time left for a question or two. There is something in the chat that we fully agree with. It's a really well done. But happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Tom, and over to everyone. We've got just a couple of minutes, but appreciate your questions either in the chat or if anyone wants to put their hand up.
Yeah, so let me talk about this. It does affect, thanks, Sam. It does affect biosecurity in Australia. In fact, James Kamek and I had a study with Matthew Cantelli and others looking at this specific question. And there was a presentation online through a CEBRAnar that sort of unpacks that. It shows, in fact, that climate change changes pest pathways in part, in fact, in large part, because it changes the pattern of exports and imports into Australia. So if you can, try and search for that online, because we've actually tried to have a look at that already, and we're going to do more about that in the coming days, because we have another new project with CEBRA trying to enhance the current value model that DAFF runs with CEBRA. And we're going to look again more carefully and specifically at pre-border measures and how they interact with climate change and other things like Trump tariffs, and all kinds of things matter to change the patterns of exports and imports. So thanks for that, Sam.
Any final questions? Oh, yeah. Okay, last one from Alex.
Yeah, there's Lisa, thank you for that. Fantastic. Thanks for posting that. Yeah, it's in scope. Alex, it's in scope for sure. We're looking at all kinds of performance measures, and we're about to start with the compliance and enforcement division to see whether or not those impacts are sufficiently large. And I'm sure they are, but let's try and calibrate and see how large they are. So there's all kinds of things that are done pre-border. We've only touched on a bit of them. And we're going to continue to work on this to make sure that, in fact, we cover all the various activities. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone. I think we're almost out of time. Sorry for the glitch with the slides, but we got there in the end. It was okay.
Not at all. Thank you, all three of you, for such an interesting and engaging presentation and the excellent slides. Sorry about the technical issues from our end. So Tom, Anca, Li, thank you again so much for joining us today. I mean, we are really reflecting here about the biosecurity system as a whole, and the kind of concept that prevention is better than cure is really one of our underlying philosophies. So it's just fantastic to have both through these case studies and also emerging in a more systematic way, the evidence to back up our further investment in all the different things we can do pre-border, not just capacity building, but like we've said, compliance activities, etc. So it's a very exciting space. I can share Tom's enthusiasm. So just to wrap up, this recording will be available shortly, and there are, as Lisa has pointed out, a whole range of existing CEBRAnar on our CEBRAnar YouTube channel, so please check it out and have a look at some of the other things that might catch your eye. And then we'll be sharing details on how to register for our next CEBRAnar, which will be in August. So thanks everybody for your participation and engagement. I hope you took something of interest away, and have a fantastic day.